Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, everybody. I hope you've had a chance to grab something to eat and also to see the amazing artworks on display. And also, there are still a couple of boards, IHRA boards, and there's information still in the marketplace about resources put together by colleagues from partner organizations. Welcome back to the afternoon session. And for those of you who are just joining us to day 2 of our conference, the International Forum on Collecting and Preserving and Disseminating Holocaust Testimonies. It's a very great pleasure for me now to introduce our keynote speaker for today, Dr. Robert Williams. Not only is he a colleague from the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, Dr. Williams was recently appointed as the Finci-Viterbi Executive Director Chair of the USC Shoah Foundation towards the end of last year. And for those of you who are in the industry, you'll know that this is the Institute for Visual History and Education. He is also the UNESCO Chair on Genocide Education and the advisor at IHRA. And we wish him all the very best in his new-ish role. And thank you very much for flying in today to be with us. Dr. Williams, over to you.
Thank you, Michael. Ooh, hot mic. Thank you for asking me to be here with all of you today. And thank you as well to the entire team at the IHRA, especially Bea, Alex, Melanie, Susan, and of course, again, my excellent colleague, Michael. Now, before we begin today, assuming this is working, I want us to actually start, as any good historian would, by thinking about our sources. And I don't mean testimony. I mean the people behind the testimonies, the survivors who entrusted us with their memories in the hopes that we will be able to share them for future generations. Each testimony represents a person. More than that, each testimony represents the memories of a person at a particular time of a particular moment. Each carry with them particular, special, and human characteristics. Now, as I say this, I imagine many of you are thinking of those survivors you've encountered in your lives. People who have affected you, people who may have inspired you to enter this field. Often enough, I think of Manya Friedman. Now, I first met Manya, as did 2 of my colleagues that I'm staring at right now, in the early 2000s. She was a volunteer at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and she was one of those few people who always brought a smile to your face. She was a model for how to live a dignified life. Now, I could tell you that Manya was born in central Poland and moved to Sosnowiec in 1938, and it was in this German border town where she first encountered anti-Semitism. The Nazis marched in, as we all know, in September of 1939. 5 days later, the synagogue was burned. Manya ended up in a factory as a slave laborer producing German military uniforms before eventually being deported to Gleiwitz in 1943, a subcamp of Auschwitz I. She was then sent to Ravensbrück, where she was eventually liberated, came to the United States in 1950, became a volunteer at the Holocaust Museum in the 1990s, and then died in 2013. But Manya was more than just facts read on a page. She was a fully fledged person who gave of her time to reach quite literally tens, if not hundreds of thousands of lives, to share a full story of her experience and the experiences of those who were around her, including her family members. Because Manya's story is not just her own. It's also the history of Sosnowiec, to a certain extent. Sorry, jet lag and Polish don't mix all the time. Sosnowiec was a town where Jewish life only really began to flourish after the mid-19th century. By the time of the German invasion and occupation of Poland, it had a Jewish population of around 24,000 people. There were a wide range of Jewish organizations, ranging from religious bodies to Zionist organizations, to educational institutions, to self-help, to charities. None of this survived. And only a few of its citizens survived, more often than not in hiding. Manya's memories help keep their histories alive. Now, for those of us who have known survivors, we understand the imperative to protect, to acquire, and to share testimony. But how can we enlighten others? How can we convert people like me, historians who are basically taught to whittle away our lives in an archive reading paper documents? Well, let's look at paper documents for a moment. Here we have a record found in the Erelson archives. This is one of only a few pages concerning a man named Tibor Eisen, actually a kid at the time. What can we tell from this record? Well, we know that Tibor was born in what is now Slovakia. We know he spoke Hungarian, Slovak, and German. He had brown eyes, he had black hair. That's about it. That's all we can really tell. But see, Tibor survived the Holocaust, emigrating to Canada, changed his name to Max Eisen, and provided testimony to a number of Holocaust-related organizations, including the USC Shoah Foundation, engaged in public projects with students and with scholars, fleshing out the document into a full human being. Let's look at another example. This was a concentration camp. This was the Pag concentration camp, actually on the Slana Cove near Pag in Croatia. The camp itself only existed for 3 months in 1941. It was created and run by the Ustasha. Some 3,500 Jews and Serbs were sent there, and about 1,000 were killed, beginning with 55 elderly Jewish prisoners in July of 1941. When the camp was abandoned, the site was occupied by Italian troops who found a mass grave of 791 people there. And that's all we really knew. There's nothing there today. Nothing grows on this island because it's all salt water. There's just rocks and a few sheep. The documentary record, such as it is, was produced by the perpetrators. A few building foundations remain. You might be able to see the outlines of them there. But that's all. Nothing to see but tourists sunning themselves on the beach, swimming in the coves where bodies would wash ashore, or hiking on the road built by the camp prisoners. You can't know what's happening here or happened here because look at it. These are 3 survivors of the Pag concentration camp. Their testimonies are being used today, literally today, by a team of archaeologists and researchers in Croatia and in Portugal, don't want to forget about the Portuguese, who are trying to reconstruct what life was like at this camp. These 3 testimonies provide evidence of the diet that prisoners had at the camp, of what their day-to-day lives were like at the camp, of deaths that took place at that camp. And Yola Gelb, the larger picture here, her testimony also only 2 weeks ago verified a story of Jewish rescue and self-help during and immediately after the Holocaust in Croatia. Testimonies matter. They should be at the core of all Holocaust-related work because they provide detail, insights, and interpersonal features that illuminate gateways to our understanding and also provide the personal connections needed to attract new audiences and make them stick with this subject for the long term. Now, this all sounds rather grand, doesn't it? But there are real challenges that we face today. For decades, local communities and national governments have invested many, many millions of pounds, since we're in the UK, to Holocaust education efforts. And this has borne fruit. We see the results of Holocaust education in our classrooms, in our museums, in cultural production like films, even in fictionalized books, flawed though they may be. This is a remarkable achievement. But many of the tactics that we employed in the past are less effective today than they used to be. There's no denying that our shared memory and knowledge of the Holocaust and its victims is very much at risk. Surveys by the Claims Conference underline this reality. Significant numbers of people in the Netherlands, about 54%, France, 57%, and the United States, shamefully 63%, don't know that 6 million Jews, roughly, were killed during the course of the Holocaust. 48% of Americans can't name a single concentration camp, a number that's also significantly similar in Canada. Looking for my Canadian colleagues, but oh, there she is. Some 12% of Dutch respondents believe the Holocaust was a myth or greatly exaggerated. But this is not just a Dutch or a French or a North American problem. In Austria, 42% of Austrians have never heard of Mauthausen. Concentration camp 100 miles, sorry, we haven't moved over to the metric system, 100 miles from Vienna. Anecdotal evidence suggests that the problem is just as great, if not more so, in many of the Central and Eastern European countries where the Holocaust occurred. Now, many studies suggest that broad swathes of the European and North American public support more Holocaust education. And mandatory secondary education on the Holocaust has become the norm across most EU countries and in the United States, and most recently in the Canadian province of Ottawa. To be certain, these initiatives can help shape future understanding, but only if they receive sustained support. They must also be part of a longer-term effort to address key educational outcomes. But what are students learning? This is also part of the problem. Most students are learning the history of Nazi Germany, the perpetrator perspective. Now, this is a principal element of the subject. You can't deny that. But it also avoids the histories of the victims and the survivors, particularly those east of Poland. Treating survivors and victims as a faceless mass diminishes their experience and limits our ability to reach new audiences. Students also learn erroneous information. In the state of Michigan, for example, the law states quite clearly that there were 11 million victims of the Holocaust. There weren't. There were, depending on the debate side of the debate you're on, anywhere from about 5.6 to 6.1 million victims. We always say 6 million. It's just easier. The Holocaust, that is the Nazi-led genocide of approximately 6 million Jews from Europe and North Africa, was an event different from the many other atrocities of the Second World War. This falsehood of an additional 5 million victims actually had benign origins. It started with Simon Wiesenthal, who was trying to build interest in the subject of the Holocaust among non-Jews. So he said 6 million Jewish victims and 5 million non-Jewish victims. Since then, this figure has plagued understanding of the subject. Now, this does not mean that the other genocides and atrocities of World War II were somehow lesser than. Each atrocity was the product of a very specific set of developments. Each progressed in their own ways, and each had their own set of victims. At times, their experiences paralleled and intersected with one another. At times, they did not. But the Holocaust was a catalyst for all of these. As the Israeli historian Yehuda Bauer has said for, 3 decades, 35 million people died during the course of the Second World War because the Nazis and their collaborators sought to eradicate the Jewish people. These other genocides and atrocities matter, and the communities affected by them include the Roma, ethnic Poles, ethnic Serbs, the disabled, members of the LGBTQ+ community, persons of African descent, and forced laborers from countries across Eastern Europe. While the Nazis and other fascist regimes might have had different motivations and approaches to each group, their experiences and fates occasionally paralleled those of the Jewish people. Any effort to teach the subject must engage with these other atrocity crimes, and our knowledge of these atrocity crimes is illuminated by Holocaust survivor testimony. But understanding the specificity of the Holocaust is perhaps more important now than at any recent point in memory, owing to the fact that violence against Jews has grown increasingly common once again. Many survivors once shared a hope that learning about the Holocaust would encourage reflection on our duty to one another and the need to build cultural pluralism. Sadly, for at least the last decade or so, anti-Semitism has increased in both North America and in Europe. In my home country, where anti-Semitism never quite reached the murderous depths that it had in Europe, Jewish life has recently become punctuated by a series of attacks, including verbal threats, vandalism, public provocation by influencers, and violent, deadly assaults. In early February 2023, the American Jewish Committee reported that 41% of American Jews feel less safe today than they did 1 year ago. 38% of Jewish Americans have changed their behavior in public out of fear of being targeted. More than half of American Jewish institutions have had to increase security in just the last calendar year. And 84% of Jewish American youth have encountered anti-Semitism online and in social media. But things are not better on this side of the Atlantic Ocean. The situation is disturbingly similar. Let's just take the 10 years between 2011 and 2021. If you review police statistics in the EU, you'll see that in only 2 EU countries, anti-Semitism fell, most notably in the Netherlands. In every other EU country that reports police statistics, which is a debate for another day, I can give a speech about that if you want, it's even more complicated, anti-Semitism rose. In most countries, the rates of increase were actually above 100%, including countries like Austria, the Czech Republic, Denmark, and disturbingly, Romania. Even in larger countries that take anti-Semitism very seriously, like Germany, anti-Semitism increased by 144% over that 10-year period. Now, fortunately, many European countries, unlike the United States, have action plans to protect Jewish life. Most of these emphasize Holocaust education. Some, but not enough, emphasize engagement with survivor testimonies. We should hope for success in these efforts and contribute to them. Police statistics aside, what do people think about Jews? I'm not going to walk you through this overcomplicated chart, but it's worth noting that this team of Hungarian-funded researchers found that anti-Semitic attitudes are predominantly strong, really across the former EU and with one former EU country. You can guess which one that is. Overall, 34% of the populations of all of these countries harbor some anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish bias, at least on an unconscious level, with Poland, Greece, Hungary, Romania, and Slovakia recording the highest numbers. Unconscious anti-Semitism is also captured by this. So the Greek statistics, which are here. In Greece, when people were asked if they had conscious negative feelings about Jews, only 36% answered in the affirmative. But unconscious bias recorded 65%. To get to unconscious bias against Jews, you have to teach people who the Jewish people are. Testimony is perhaps one of the best ways to do this, particularly in areas where the Jewish community no longer exists or where it is too small to have an effective voice. We also have to acknowledge the growing problem of Holocaust distortion and disinformation. Why not denial? Because denial is a micro-phenomenon in our parts of the world today. Disinformation focused on the Holocaust is on the rise. In part, it is due to the passage of time, but in part, it is consciously deployed, including by state actors, something I'll talk about in a moment. Now, whereas a Holocaust denier is just trying to convince you that the Holocaust never happened in order to make Nazism great again or to legitimize anti-Semitism, a Holocaust distorter essentially twists, excuses, minimizes, or otherwise misrepresents the Holocaust and its contemporary relevance. For all intents and purposes, Holocaust distortion is an incredibly common and seemingly more acceptable form of misinformation. But it's tricky, because most forms of distortion do not deny the reality of the Holocaust per se. It's also difficult to identify the motives behind it. Is somebody distorting for cynical anti-Semitic reasons, or is it because they don't know the facts? At the end of the day, it really doesn't matter. I want you to think of it this way. On a moral level, Holocaust distortion is an insult to the memories of victims and survivors. On perhaps the more important practical level, it can act as a gateway drug, if you will, to conspiracy thinking, to outright Holocaust denial, and to more dangerous forms of anti-Semitism. It needs to be dealt with. Now, distortion takes on a number of forms. We're not going to review them all. Let's just deal with the lowlights. Obviously, we are all aware of questions and debates around the number of victims of the Holocaust. Not much needs to be said about that. Some forms of distortion cast the Holocaust as something positive or humorous, or accuse Jews of using the Holocaust for some form of pecuniary gain. This is a form of distortion we see in parts of the Middle East. This is the runner-up in an Iranian Holocaust cartoon competition, but it's also something that we see in Europe. This is from a slate of cartoons that I have from across Europe. This one just happens to be from Poland, but you see it everywhere. At times, there are those who blame Jews for the Holocaust, a tactic that actually began with the Nazis. Now, this is not only historically inaccurate, it's also morally indefensible. And it really takes on two forms. On the one hand, you'll have people say that there's something in the innately Jewish character, an older anti-Semitic theme, that led to the Holocaust. And in parts of Eastern Europe, you'll hear references to Judeo-communism, the misnomer that Jews were overwhelmingly communist, and depending on how this term is deployed, it can be a wink and a nod to say that the Holocaust was just an anti-communist action and therefore excusable. Now, these references are inexcusable because they're a form of bait and switch that open the door to anti-Semitism. State-sponsored distortion is also something that we face every day. Now, sometimes it can be rather innocent, like this museum, the Military History Museum in Vienna, which you can visit today, and it has very nice Nazi uniforms without any explanation as to why they're problematic. But sometimes it's much more conscious and deliberate. This is a billboard that appeared in Crimea in 2014, right before it was taken over by the Russian Federation. It essentially says that the people of Crimea had two choices: peace under the Russian Federation or rule under the Nazis. An extreme reference to Ukraine. Since 2014, the Russians have become less subtle in their propaganda on this front. There are also attempts, even today, to honor, rehabilitate, and whitewash the reputations of individuals and organizations complicit in Holocaust-era crimes. By this, I don't only mean the Lukov marches that take place almost every year, except this year, fortunately, in Bulgaria, or marches in honor of SS legions that take place regularly in Latvia. There are also attempts to restore the reputations of individuals across the spectrum in countries that were part of the Axis, in countries that were occupied by the Axis, in countries that were neutral during the war, like in Spain, and in countries that were part of the Alliance, including the United States and the United Kingdom. Don't go to Bradford Cathedral. At times, the so-called rehabilitated have been subject to official processes, like a high court overturning a long-past judicial sentence. This individual here, his name was Leon Rupnik. Leon Rupnik was the Nazi collaborator in charge of Ljubljana. He was captured, tried, and shot in 1946. His death sentence was overturned by the Slovenian Supreme Court in January of 2020. He is still dead. Nevertheless, by overturning his sentence, it can open the pathway for him to be seen as acceptable or even part of a pantheon in Slovenian society. Other times, rehabilitation happens before courts can even get involved. Here, we have a statue of Roman Shukevich. Shukevich was a Ukrainian Nazi collaborator. He was a member of the Waffen-SS. He was complicit not only in the murder of Jews, but in the murder of about 100,000 ethnic Poles in Volhynia. He was rehabilitated by the Ukrainian government in the 1990s. They've printed commemorative coins in his name. They even named a football stadium after him in Ternopil a year before the most recent Russian invasion of Ukraine. Other times, the rehabilitated never went to trial and went on to fame after the war. The picture on the bottom left is a group photo from Operation Paperclip, a group of Nazi scientists brought to my home country at the end of the war to take us to the moon. One of these individuals was Wernher von Braun, friend of Walt Disney, helped get us to the moon, also oversaw the V-2 rocket program that used tens of thousands of mostly Jewish slave laborers at the end of the Second World War. Until about 2 years ago, there was a statue of him at a NASA facility in Huntsville, Alabama. This is a shared problem. Nobody walks away clean, and why is this? It's not always through bad intentions. It's in part because most members of the broader public are more likely to know the names of perpetrators than they are survivors and victims. Testimony can help turn this dynamic around. We need to prioritize understanding the perspectives of the individuals and not their perpetrators. Now, my depressing speech is not done yet. We are also facing more and more democratic backsliding and declines in civil discourse, the erosion of mutual respect, conspiracy-based thinking is on the rise. Shifts in education often belie nationalistic agendas, and there's a legitimate fear of mass violence becoming normalized against marginalized communities, including Jewish communities. In this environment, almost every statement, I probably have made several hundred of them already, seems to carry ideological or political weight. Nevertheless, our subject and the individuals who gave us their histories rise above politics, rise above ideology. They cut across the human condition. We need to consider solutions from the past. I'll give you one example, not related to testimony. Within 2 generations of 1945, Germany, or at least West Germany, became an outwardly peaceable, democratic, somewhat tolerant country. Although imperfect, the Holocaust continues to be taught today, continues to be debated today, continues to remain vital in German society today. The German people deserve a lot of credit for this, yes, but this did not come about only from within Germany. It was the product of international cooperation, the product of engagement with different societies, and the product of engagement with survivors. Now, will that lesson translate after the survivors leave us? The only way to do so is making sure that survivor testimony reaches more audiences. I'll come back to this in a moment, but we also need to look at the German example for one other reason. The educational efforts instituted by the primarily UK and US governments in West Germany did not restrict education on these subjects to the secondary level. Most of the education went to journalists, policymakers, the broader public, museum exhibitions. There's still too much of a tendency to think that the solution remains in the minds of the 14-year-old. I had 2 years of ancient Greek in high school. I don't remember any of it. It's because I never engaged with it later in life. We need to build resilience through better education and engagement, including through testimony. We need to teach individuals to identify with one another and to stand up against forces that would otherwise tear us apart. Now, contrary to what some of you may have read in recent articles, we don't need to abandon Holocaust education or fool ourselves into believing that Holocaust education makes things worse. Impressionistic essays based on select conversations with a few educators are not an adequate indictment of the field. If you haven't read the article, I'd be happy to talk to you about it offline. Nevertheless, we need to ask ourselves important questions posed by these recent articles. Why do we see rising rates of anti-Semitism at the same time that we also have greater access to Holocaust education? We have to admit something that many of us have long known. Holocaust education by itself is insufficient to stop anti-Semitism. It can complement efforts. It's an important part of education against anti-Semitism and hate, but it is not a panacea by itself. Testimony has to be part of the way forward. Now, most testimonies follow strict methodologies about life before, during, and after the Shoah. This is because those who took testimonies understand that you have to know what was destroyed in order to process the scale of the loss. These testimonies, in turn, affirm another essential truth, namely that the Holocaust, although it was a paradigmatic crime born of anti-Semitism, was certainly not the only anti-Semitic crime in our history. Murderous hatred of Jews has a legacy that lasts, as you can read in my forthcoming book, at least 2,300 years. It did not begin in 1933 or 1939 or 1941, and it certainly did not end in 1945. Our understanding of anti-Semitism has to confront the realities of the Shoah, but we need to realize that the story did not end there. Moreover, the anti-Semite might not always be wearing an armband. The mass murder of 6 million Jews in the middle of the last century should be a clarion call to take action now. Training people to identify and respond to anti-Semitism through testimony and within frameworks designed to counter extremism is a first step. This should include learning about the Holocaust, of course, but survivors also tell us about Jewish life before and after the Holocaust, its vibrancy and how it engages with non-Jewish communities as well. Now, I'm going to say something controversial. You might be thinking, well, there's plenty of books to read. How many have young children? How many think their children read as much as we did? Not a lot of people like to read today. Audiovisual testimonies, the authentic histories of those who experienced life in the 20th and 21st centuries can provide new perspectives, new gateways to our subject. As I said a moment ago, we also cannot limit our education just to youth. We have to educate adult audiences. Early classroom education is an investment in the future, but it only flourishes through consistent engagement with the topic over time. Again, be it through museums or films or books or online media or through emerging technology. We also have to engage in dialogue with those segments of our society tasked with notionally making us better, Fox News aside. That includes journalists and policymakers. That includes judges and police officers. That includes, heaven help us, elected officials. They need to engage with these subjects. This leads to a third and critical point. Education about the Holocaust and anti-Semitism has to focus on individual victims. Most of our awareness of the crimes of anti-Semitism remain viewed through the lens created by the perpetrator. Timothy Snyder often says that about 95% of the scholarship produced comes from perpetrator sources. I think that's being generous based on my background, and I would argue Johanna's background as well. I think we still rely on the perpetrator entirely too much. To understand these atrocities in ways that encourage an ethically informed citizenry, we have to encourage understanding of one another and of the individual. That is why microhistories are so important. We have to understand the victims and survivors as people, hear from eyewitnesses, learn from the memories of individual survivors, to view the human experience through the lens of those who lived these histories. This gives us a chance to realize that those who went through the worst and most unimaginable of ordeals were real people, with family, with friends. They had admirable features. They had exceptional experiences that helped them survive, but they also had all too human flaws. They were like us. They were vibrant. They were not born victims. A series of conditions, adherence to the words of extremists, the separation of communities, and the apathy of the public made them victims. We need to see them for who they were. To have any hope out of the current dismal situation in which we find ourselves, we have to wrestle with the words of the survivor. And only then will we be able to see our common humanity. Thank you.
Rob, thank you. That was absolutely masterful and spellbinding. Thank you very, very much. We are, as we have been doing all day today, running a little bit behind with time, but I think we can't let Rob go without at least a couple of questions. And also, I'm going to offer him up in the coffee break that follows the next session as well. So if we have literally one or two questions now, and before we move on to the next session. And perhaps if you could please, yes, Anita. Is there a mic somewhere? Or I can repeat the question. Or Rob, you.
I represent an organisation from generation to generation. We enable the second and third generation using testimony to tell their family stories. And I wholeheartedly agree with you that it is about these individual stories that need to be told. But the one thing, if you don't mind me saying, I'm not hearing, is what is your view, and is the Shoah Foundation doing anything to engage with second and third generation to create that link? Because I've been desperate to hear that all morning, because I think that the majority of us here, or many people here, are second generation, and we do believe that we've got a really, really important role to play, and we want to be part of this conversation.
Should we do two at a time?
Sure. Yeah. One more for now. Oh, sorry. Just here.
Well, we are, it's the second day, second part, but we are not talking about the elephant in the room. It's, I live in Sweden, in a place called Lund, which is next to Malmö. Yes. And in Sweden, Holocaust education is part of the curriculum. But quite a lot of schools in the Malmö area does not teach it at all. What can we do in order to facilitate the teaching of the immigrant society that was built up in Sweden? And obviously this has a lot of influence on current policies of various governments on the refugees.
Anita, if I may, thank you. It's a very, very important question. It's something that we are currently not only researching, but actively engaging in. And I think you also have to now include 4Gs in the discussion. So, I don't like talking about myself, but I'm one of the State Department's expert speakers, which means they basically send me around and have me deal with countering extremism in different parts of the world every now and then. I was in Slovakia the early part of this year. There was a third generation young man who was Jewish, who was being bullied in his school, went home, spoke with his grandmother who was a survivor, said, "What do I do? What do I do?" She said, "Take me to school." Brings grandma to school. She talks about what it's like to be Jewish in Slovakia, before that in Czechoslovakia, before that in Hungary, because it's one of those parts of the country that, well, the borders change pretty quickly. That led to a speaking tour all throughout the country in order to counter anti-Semitism. Now, we're not going to be able to do that with survivors for much longer. Survivors, I can tell you, even though it's a report that hasn't come out yet, depending on where they live, are passing at rates of 10 to 16% per year, depending on what their experiences were. Utilizing testimonies in a way that engage, I would argue perhaps even more with 3 Gs than with 2 Gs, is a path forward. To have people say, this is my grandmother. She influenced me to do this with my life, or I never knew this about her until I dealt with her testimony. And to have those conversations with different audiences, side by side with the testimony, it can be very, very powerful. Also in Slovakia, the cultural affairs officer at the US Embassy in Bratislava, her grandmother was a survivor. We went to the town of Nitra. She showed a few clips from her grandmother's testimony, and she spoke about how speaking with her grandmother compelled her into public service, and the whole audience in this town that used to have a vibrant Jewish population, the population is now 70 people, most of the audience were not Jewish, immediately clicked, immediately became engaged. Now, if I were to be critical, I think too many of these efforts only focus on secondary schools. It's the parent coming in with a testimony of their parent or their grandparent and trying to share that story. I think that's part of it, but we need to go beyond. We need to have public engagements around this. We need to figure out ways. It doesn't even have to be the descendant of a survivor. Young college-age students are always trying to figure out who they are. Maybe you have young Jewish students on college campuses work with survivor testimony to understand something about Jewish life and culture, a history and a legacy that was torn from them by the Shoah that they can recapture. But we're only just at the start of having these discussions. But it's an extremely important point. The only way we're going to find solutions, though, I mentioned international cooperation. There's no single approach. We need to, I'm a Robert F. Kennedy guy. I want to raise all ships at the same time, and I think we all need to work together on it. Sir, Sweden. You can, of course, mandate Holocaust education. There are flaws in that. There are not just the flaws I mentioned earlier about what is being taught, often coming from the perspective of the perpetrator. You see in certain countries the laws governing educational curricula changing in ways so that the narrative that is being taught is a subjective narrative about the Holocaust. So you can have an overemphasis on rescue, for example, which you see in certain Eastern European countries, giving the impression that rescue was the norm when it was the exception. You can have, I like to talk about Russia. The Russian Federation changed its memory laws several times over the last few years so that it protects the state-mandated narrative about the Second World War, which just conveniently forgets things like the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and the fact that the Soviet Union occupied Poland. So mandatory education's not always going to work. What could work, especially with increasingly diverse audiences, is waking up to a reality that I think many of us in this room understand. The Holocaust was a moment in our shared human existence that shaped the world we live in today. There are very few of these moments. The French Revolution was certainly one. A time when the old regime changed because something drastic caused this rupture. The Holocaust was also one of those moments. Our common covenant to one another was shattered by the Holocaust, and although our forebears did not realize this when they created the conditions that shaped the modern international community, things like the Genocide Convention, the Refugee Conventions, the United Nations itself, were all framed in part with the Holocaust in mind. The Holocaust has a very important component in civic education, especially as we try to work toward what UNESCO calls global citizenship education. Integrating the Holocaust into that is one way to deal with the tensions of trying to teach the subject to communities that may not have a direct engagement with the Holocaust, but by dint of the fact that their diasporic communities live in the international community, they've still nevertheless been affected by it. Okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me again in thanking Rob for that excellent speech. And we're going to segue quickly into the next session. So if I can invite the speakers of the next session to come up onto the panel.
All right, thank you very much, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Aviva Dautch. I am the Executive Director of Jewish Renaissance, which is the UK's quarterly Jewish cultural magazine. And it's my real privilege today to chair the following panel, which includes some second-generation speakers, Anita, and is about that notion of testimony, but within books. We're going to look at how you tell stories, who are the audiences for our stories, and what is the impact and importance of them. Because these books, all three of these books that we're going to look at today, are based on testimony, but in their own way, they each become testimonies themselves, carrying on the door by door, generation to generation. Before we start, I'm going to introduce our speakers in a moment, but I just wanted to ask, did anyone else arriving here come past Buckingham Palace? I did. And when I did, as I walked past, I was thinking of one of the people in one of these books. Rob just said testimonies are about people. So one of my favourite people in all three books, I hope you don't mind the intimacy, but I feel like I know her, Daniel, is your Aunt Louisa. Because there's a line, she has many, many interesting lines in this book. The book is Hitler, Stalin, Mum and Dad, putting all four on the same level, which I quite like, which is Lord Daniel Finklestein's book, which is out in June. And in it, his Grandma Louisa says, the Queen, at that point it was the Queen is safe in Buckingham Palace. We are safe in Hendon. And there's this notion of this kind of safety of England that allows the family to settle, to flourish, to ensure continuity. But what Daniel then goes on to say in the book is that feeling he had 10 years or so ago of safety, being as safe in Hendon, in the London suburbs, as the Queen was in Buckingham Palace, has begun to shift. And that was part of the impetus for him writing his book. So that's where we're going to come to. I think we'll come to his book with his permission last. And I think we'll explore maybe why now more than ever these testimonies are needed. But I'm going to start first of all with Jonathan Freedland. Jonathan, who's sitting at the other end of the panel, I'm sure many, many people in this audience know. They either know as the columnist or former Washington correspondent of The Guardian. You may know him from BBC's The Long View, one of my favourite listens on Radio 4, contemporary history series. You might know him from one of his podcasts, perhaps Unholy, where he talks and investigates topical issues with the Israeli journalist Yonit Levy. He's also a thriller writer. He's written many Sam Bourne thrillers. And the book that he's going to tell us about in a moment, The Escape Artists, begins with something of that thriller feeling as Rudy Verber and Alfred Wetzler escape from Auschwitz. Now, I'm mentioning Verber, who is the main subject of Jonathan's book, alongside Wetzler, because a couple of days ago in Israel at the big Yom HaShoah ceremony, 18 people were honored, and 4 of the 18 appear in Jonathan's book. Verber was one of them, together with Wetzler, and also Ernest Rosin and Czesław Mordowitz, who escaped just about a month or so later. And between those 4 men, there are reports of what Auschwitz was like became the Auschwitz protocols and informed leaders from Roosevelt to Churchill sitting not far from this room, and helped them begin to make that decision to bomb Auschwitz. So I'm going to pass over to Jonathan to start us off, to explain why he chose Verba as the topic of his memoir and the testimony that he used.
Thank you, Aviva. Thank you, Aviva. Thanks to all of you here. You've summarized it very well. The book, The Escape Artist, is the story of Rudolf Verba, one of the very first, one of that tiny handful of Jews ever to escape from Auschwitz, which already would put him in a vanishingly small category. But what made him hugely fascinating to me is the motive for the escape. Obviously, everybody would have wanted to escape from Auschwitz, but Verba and Wetzler had this extra drive, which was to inform the world. They were convinced that the only reason this place could continue to exist, that thousands were being killed there every day, was the fact that the rest of the world clearly, surely, could not know. In fact, that was what Verba said afterwards, was when asked, how did you know that people didn't know? He would say, well, obviously they couldn't have known because this place wouldn't exist if they did know. He believed the world would never allow it to exist. His driving purpose within that purpose was to warn his fellow Jews. He was sure in April 1944, when he finally mounted this attempt, that the next Jewish community to come to Auschwitz would be the last one not yet pulled into the Nazi inferno, namely the Jews of Hungary. And he was desperate to get word to the Jews of Hungary because his belief, which I detail in the book, was that it was ignorance of their fate that partly explained why it was that the Jews who arrived on those trains into Auschwitz behaved with relative calm and quiet and compliance, in his view, was because they had been lied to at every stage of their journey. And they believed they were being resettled for new lives in the East, and therefore, yes, they did get off the trains, and in some cases almost relieved to get off the trains, and lined up as they were told, because they believed this was the beginning of a new start. So he thought the only way to slow down this Nazi, very efficient Nazi killing machine, would be if those victims, as they arrived, knew what fate awaited them. So that's really the theme of the book, and this is how it opens. 7th of April, 1944. After days of delay, weeks of obsessive preparation, months of watching the failed attempts of others, and 2 years of seeing the depths to which human beings could sink, the moment had finally come. It was time to escape. The 2 other prisoners were already there at the designated spot. Wordlessly, they gave the nod. Do it now. Walter and Fred did not hesitate. They climbed on top of the timbers, found the opening, and one after the other, they dropped inside. A second later, their comrades moved the planks into place above their heads. One of them whispered, "Bon voyage." And then all was dark and silent. Without delay, Walter set to work. He pulled out the machorka, the cheap Soviet tobacco he'd been told about, a batch that had been prepared as instructed, soaked in petrol and dried. Slowly, he began to wedge it into the cracks between the wooden boards, sometimes blowing on it gently, puffing it into place, hoping against hope that the Soviet prisoner of war who had taught him the trick was right, that the scent would be repellent to dogs. Not that they were relying solely on Walter's handiwork. They'd already made sure that the ground around the hideout was liberally sprinkled with the treated tobacco so that the canine SS would not even draw near. If the Red Army man's confidence was well-founded, Walter and Fred should be able to crouch in this hole beneath the woodpile, silent and undisturbed, for exactly as long as they needed, 3 days and 3 nights. So that's the opening of the story, explaining the opening of this incredibly audacious escape attempt. As Aviva mentioned, they did incredibly get out. They did, as incredibly, manage to cross Nazi-occupied Poland. By the way, I called him Walter there. That was the name he was born. Walter Rosenberg. He became Rudolf Werber later. But they crossed Nazi-occupied Poland through mountains and forests and rivers and marshland, dodging Nazi bullets as they went, and eventually made it to their home country of Slovakia, and there, in hiding in a basement, in contact with the remnant Jewish community of Slovakia, they managed to pour out the details of Auschwitz-Birkenau, which Rudy in particular had memorized in an astonishing feat of memory, memorizing every single transport, some 300 transports he had witnessed personally. And that report then got out into the world. The book details that the response to that report was not quite what Rudy and Fred had hoped for, but that's in a way another story. To the point about testimony, this book would have been, first of all, this book is about the most extraordinary act of bearing witness. In a way, one of the very first, the first fullest account of Auschwitz, the first testimony of Auschwitz we have is the Werber-Wetzler report. As Aviva said, 6 weeks later, 2 further escapees used the same method and added to that, those Auschwitz protocols, Auschwitz report. But it was the first act of testimony. But second, this book that I've written would not be possible without survivor testimony. Just before I came up here, flicked through the sort of footnotes, the end notes of my book at random in a little exercise, and just sort of stuck my finger in one at random, and the first 3 were all survivor testimonies of different kinds. There were other documents I used, but the bulk of them were survivor interviews or memoirs. So the book itself, the story of testimony, would be impossible without testimony. Within that, the key testament is from Werber himself. He wrote a memoir in 1963. It's been published under different titles. I Cannot Forgive, revealingly, was the first title. That was an absolutely essential source for me, but it was not the only one. He also was interviewed by 2 or 3 key interviewers. I like to think that the very best chroniclers of the Holocaust understood the significance of Rudolf Werber, even if many, many others didn't. And so, for example, Claude Lanzmann, who the maker of that absolutely extraordinary 9.5-hour documentary Shoah, he interviewed Werber, and there were hundreds, just close to 200, 150 pages of transcripts of that interview, which I had access to. Martin Gilbert also sought out Rudolf Werber. The Jeremy Isaacs, who made the Genocide episode of the World at War series, he sought out Werber. Those transcripts, in 2 of those 3 cases, the transcripts still existed and were crucial sources for me. An odd one, an active testimony that you would never expect. Before the David Irving trial, there was another trial of a Holocaust denier, namely Ernst Zindel, in Canada in 1985. The star witness, because he then lived in Canada, was Rudolf Werber. He was on the stand for days and days and days. Little did that Holocaust denier know that in doing that, that transcript would still exist and be a vital source for me in writing this book of further Holocaust testimony, to prove to you that good, I think, can come out of extreme evil. He was interrogated, cross-examined by another Holocaust denier, the lawyer, and asked for further details going beyond what was in his memoir. Little did he know he was doing a great act of service to the memory and posterity of the Holocaust in his attempt to deny the Holocaust, because we now have even more detail. And then finally, I managed to find, this is where I'll end, Rudolf Werber's first wife, who was living in London, age 93, in the summer of 2020. She was a friend of this organization that's partly involved today, the Association of Jewish Refugees. Her name, Gerta Verbova. She spoke to this group more than once. She had written her own story, but crucially for my purposes, she not only was Rudy's first wife, she had also been his teenage sweetheart in Trnava, in Slovakia. It goes to what Robert was saying before about these people being real people with full lives. As a 12-year-old, she had had a crush on 14-year-old Walter Rosenberg and was able to talk to me about the boy before the man, the boy before Auschwitz. We sat together for 6 afternoons in the summer of 2020, socially distanced in that plague summer, and in her garden, as she told me about him. And on the last of those meetings, she said to me, my young grandson is here because I have something I want to give you, and it's upstairs and it's too heavy for me to bring down. He went upstairs and came down with a red suitcase, which the two of them handed to me, and 93-year-old Goethe said, those are Rudy's letters. And it was the moment where I thought, I am meant to write this book. And those letters are themselves acts of testimony. A few days later, I got a phone call from Goethe's grandson to say that Goethe had passed away. I felt as if she had completed her last act of bearing witness, and the result is this book, The Escape Artist. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Jonathan, and I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions for you about that process of uncovering Werber. But I just wanted to tell everyone who hasn't read the book, your connection to this story starts when you were 19, doesn't it? Sitting there and watching one of those great acts of testimony itself.
It absolutely does. It began with seeing this film, Shoah. You know, when I was 19 and hearing this man talk about having been 19 and having escaped from Auschwitz, and, you know, I didn't know much, but I knew enough to know that Jews basically didn't escape from Auschwitz. So my sort of jaw dropped on the floor. The odd thing about it was that Landsman himself in that film was not that interested in the escape. He doesn't really ask Werber about it. He's more interested in the fact that Werber, incredibly unusually, had been in Auschwitz for 21 months and was this sort of ultra witness. I call him sometimes a panoramic witness because as a slave, he had worked in almost every part of the camp and therefore was able to give this full view of the camp. But I was just struck by it then, and that story stayed with me for, you know, all of my life. And then I found myself going back to it 2 or 3 years ago, partly because of this business of truth and post-truth, and how Werber had done everything to get the truth out. And that was, the result was this story. But no, it began with a film which is itself entirely about survivor testimony, namely Claude Lanzmann's Shoah.
Yeah. Brilliant. Well, thank you so much. And there are so many connections that go through, which maybe we'll pull out from your book to the others. And I think I'll start with that kind of idea of letters, what we find in letters, because I'm going to come to Karen next, Karen Baum Gordon, who is sitting here with her book, The Last Letter, which is about her relationship to her father and his relationship to his parents. And at the core of the book are 88 letters that her grandmother, your father's mother, Julie, wrote to your father. And again, that kind of stumbling across this treasure trove of first-hand written testimony seems to be kind of so much at the core of your book. Although there is another kind of more painful really instance that is the kind of drive behind you starting, which I'm sure you're going to tell us all about. But let me just introduce you in the book a little bit first, because many of us here know Jonathan and Daniel, but one of the pleasures of getting to do a panel like this is you get to meet first on the page and now on the stage new voices and new people. And it was such a pleasure reading Karen's book, because it's a really brave and courageous one. You know, you're not just dealing with kind of the easy stories, but you're dealing with the very painful, complicated emotions when people aren't able to be saved and aren't able to save as well, and what that means. So Karen is the daughter of Rudolf Baum, who is himself a survivor, but he tried to save his parents, unfortunately unsuccessfully. He was born a German Jew in 1915, and when he was 86 came a moment that would be unforgettable for Karen and really mean she had to kind of investigate who he was and what had happened to him and those parents. Her grandparents were, well, actually, I'm going to let Karen tell you, but over 5 parts of the book, Karen really explores their story as much as his story, and the kind of psychological impact of it. And that kind of last letter is a father's ethical will that comes out of that, which you really seem to be living up to. So I'm going to pass over to you, Karen, to tell us about your story, and then maybe we'll have a little conversation.
Well, first let me say it really is an honor and a privilege to be part of this forum and to be sitting up here with you. You know, I was thinking about, having heard other people speak, if I were to give a title to this for 10 minutes speak, what would it be? And I would say it would be using testimony to solve a mystery and to dilute multi-generational trauma. That would be the title. I didn't set out to write a book, but let me give you the top line story. So the top line story, as Aviva said, is that my father was born in Frankfurt, Germany, and he immigrated to the US in 1936 at the age of 21, leaving behind his parents. They encouraged him to go. His sister had emigrated to Palestine 2 years earlier. And he came to the US, he joined the American Army, he ended up becoming a naturalized citizen. He then participated in the liberation of Buchenwald. In the meanwhile, his parents were deported from Frankfurt to the Łódź ghetto, and they perished there. Now, my father, who was, if you met him, incredibly engaged with life, extroverted, connected to community, very much alive. But suddenly, at the age of 86, my father attempted to take his own life. And thanks to modern medicine, he went on to live another 7 years, and he didn't remember that attempt. He left a note that said, "I am a tortured soul." So once he passed away, I became a woman with a mission. What was that tortured soul? I became compelled to figure that out. Now, what I had, as Aviva mentioned, I had really a treasure trove of these 88 letters. And they were written in Suderlein script with some effort. I found someone to translate those. And I also had my father. He didn't, you know, we've talked a little bit about how much did people speak about this. Growing up, I asked a lot of questions. He would answer questions when asked. I was the one of the 3 kids that would ask. But when he turned 75 and had triple bypass, and I think had a brush with his own mortality, he was out there on the circuit. I mean, I grew up in Dallas. He was talking to the Texas State Legislature. He was a docent in the Holocaust Museum. He was going to churches and synagogues and meeting with kids, and he was really out there. So I have a lot of, thank goodness, videos of him speaking, essays that he wrote. He did write his autobiography and many interviews. So that's what I consider the testimony that I used in the book. Before I share with you how testimony really informed the writing, again, it sort of evolved. I really didn't set out to write this book. I'm going to share with you an excerpt. And this excerpt is, I made 3 trips to Frankfurt and 1 trip back to Poland, actually with a survivor of that ghetto, which was extraordinary, with my 2 sons, as well as her then 46-year-old son. But this particular passage is when I was with a girlfriend in Frankfurt, and we were in search of the second residence where my grandparents, they lived in 3, they were evicted a few times, the second residence, and my father had lived there the last 2 years in Frankfurt. So I'm just going to read this small bit. Lauren and I then walked from Reuterweg 73 in search of Eisenneckstraße 20, where my grandparents and father had moved to in 1934. As we continued on our way in a thin veil of continuous drizzle, we juggled our cheap umbrellas and half-torn maps and really struggled to read the street signs. And then we stumbled upon a lush forest green blanket, the Holzhausen Park. Just on the other side of it, we entered a wide street with its breathtaking alley, a 50-foot grass carpet rolled down the middle, symmetrically lined with trees more than 100 years old. Checking the map, we realized, we are on Eisenneckstraße. We arrived at number 20, pale pink with 4 cherub friezes on its facade. Lauren and I puzzled over which one had belonged to my grandparents. Seemingly out of nowhere, a drenched young woman on a bicycle approached the front gate. Well, I quickly shifted from relaxed picture-taking mode into determined detective. In my poor German, I asked if I could accompany her to whomever was going to buzz her in. The next minute, I was chatting with a 40-something, dark-haired man, handsome and slight, who not only grew up in this house, but also was the current owner. Alex Zahn, he said by way of introduction. Zahn, as in teeth in German. And yes, I could come in. Upon entering, I noticed the polished mahogany banister with its countless nicks and scratches, some of them from cherished wedding bands they wore, from sharp-edged packages they moved in or out. And as we walked upstairs, I savored each step. On the 3rd floor, I met Alex's elderly mother, who explained that she and her husband bought the house from the children of the original owners. That would have been the Hermanns, from whom my grandparents had rented, which I knew, because my grandmother had written about that. We proceeded to the 4th floor. The apartment's entryway was relatively large, and the bathroom off the entryway was huge. Alex then showed me the sitting room with a desk, and I pictured my grandmother sitting at just such a desk, gazing out and writing those cherished letters to my father, wearing, in fact, this bracelet. Then we entered what must have been my father's bedroom. It was small, but with 2 windows, one looking out on the alley and another on the air shaft. It was there that my father slept his last night under the same roof as his parents, that he did dream his last dreams in Frankfurt. So that is an example of how testimony informed my primary research. I knew about the Hermanns because my grandmother wrote about them, and I spent time with an archivist in the Frankfurt Jewish Museum and looked them up, and who were they, and what did they do, et cetera. But I want to spend just a few minutes on how testimony really added texture to what I would call recorded history or secondary research. So I want to share with you just a handful of examples, both from my grandmother as well as from my father. We all know the pain and have heard and read in many contexts, the Holocaust and others, about families being separated. And sadly, I know many sitting in this room with respect to the survivors in this room of families being separated. But there was nothing quite like reading my grandmother's words. I quote, "Sometimes it does seem like a dream to me. You are here again. I keep your things in order." I mean, imagine this. I keep your things in order. And I cook your favorite dishes. I think of you lots and lots and don't let myself realize how long we may be separated. But I have the feeling that you are coming alive and can breathe as a free young human. I mean, for me, that just gave so much more to the notion that I knew they had been separated. And carrying that a step further, as a mother, separated from children and doing mothering, what I would call mothering from afar. And by the way, I was the age of my grandmother, who was older, of course, that's why she thought she would survive. And our oldest son was the age of my father when I was having these letters translated, which was quite powerful. But her mothering from afar was just unbelievable in these cherished letters. I mean, imagine. Should I send you a few more recipes? Please don't embarrass me, and don't make any pudding with lumps. And how about the laundering of socks, she wrote? It's best, you wash them yourself in Persil, approximately a small tablespoon per bowl, dissolve in cold water, and wash lukewarm and rinse well cold. No soap remaining. Otherwise, they become hard and matted. And what about your underwear? Can you keep it in good repair? I mean, is this a mother or what? It was so incredible. And she went on. My father at some point said he was taking driving lessons because he was becoming a driver for a salesman. She says, I have only one worry. Be very careful while driving. Please take care and don't race around. I mean, I can hear my own mother saying that to me. I can hear myself saying it to my children. And lastly, from my grandmother, very, well, this says it all. This was in January 1937, and I would say this is a bit of sarcasm to cover the disdain, really. Since these letters were censored, obviously she wasn't quite blatant about talking about what was really going on, but instead she writes this. Our current apartment has been rented, a couple with children. They greeted us very nicely with the German greeting. Okay, can kind of figure that out. Yesterday, January 30th, was marked by the seizure of power. Big celebrations everywhere, meeting of the Reichstag, a big speech. We went to the movies in the evening to celebrate. A charming film, Spiel on Board, that means play on board. And by the way, it's a German comedy. It premiered in November of '36, and it's about a journey on the Bremen to America. So again, here's where testimony for me really added so much more to understand what her experience was like being there on those marking days, those anniversary days of January 30th, year after year. I mean, having that gave so much more. And now I want to share just two examples from my father, which I could, obviously in all of these, giving you dozens. I'm giving you some real key ones. So we know so many survivors, and so many of us, myself included, this notion of collective guilt. What does it mean? How do we feel about it? What is that? So my father, in 1945, after the liberation of Buchenwald, went to Marburg, and he was part of it wasn't unique to Marburg, nor unique to his army unit. He headed an army unit to create a free press. And there were many of these free presses set up all across Germany and I think elsewhere in Europe. My father knew nothing about newspapers, nothing. But it was his job to interview somebody to be an editor, to be the publisher, to be reporters. And who was he interviewing? Hello, he was interviewing Germans who had lived there through the war. So my father wrote, and I think he ended up with quite an enlightened view about collective guilt, given what his life experience was. In screening so many different people, I got to meet individuals who proved to be decent human beings, who had been active in the anti-Nazi movement. Yet I still had problems dealing with Germans. I did a lot of soul searching and reluctantly concluded that not every German could be held responsible for the heinous crimes committed during the Nazi years. For me to have those words, it was very helpful to me. I mean, I do a lot of coaching, and I'd always have this little bit of a feeling when I was coaching people of German descent. This was really instructive to me and to my boys, really helpful. And then the last one I want to share is something, ironically, that Eva alluded to. So the book is called The Last Letter because the mystery really was solved in the last letter that my grandmother wrote to my father but also in the last letter that my father wrote to us, his 3 children, his ethical will. So the mystery solved is that, I mean, I may as well share that with you, that my grandmother wrote, all our faith is in you. You have to get us out. We will not survive if not you. You have been in America long enough. You must do it. So my father lived with that every day. He, as somebody said, he was surviving the surviving every day. He then wrote a last letter, an ethical will, to us about his regrets and wishes, etc. So what my father wrote, and this is the ultimate testimony, leaving home in 1936 and subsequently losing my parents in the Holocaust were the 2 most defining events in my life. Having to leave Germany changed the course of my life. The loss of my parents left me with a feeling of guilt that stayed with me forever. Nothing can change what happened, but I do not want my parents to be forgotten. I now ask you to observe the yard side of the grandparents you never knew and who contributed so much to your lives. So I'd like to think I have done that and more. And I'd like to close with a quote from my great uncle, there's 3 greats there, was Rabbi Abraham Geiger, founder of Reformed Judaism. And Geiger wrote, drawing from the past, living in the present, shaping the future. I believe that is exactly what testimony enables us to do. Thank you.
Thank you for being so open and personal. Thank you for being so open and so personal in your talk, as you are in the book. I mean, I think you're beginning to get the sense of Karen's book. It's a very intimate, family kind of memoir. It has the political weight of history, but that old feminist refrain, the personal is political. It's also about bringing these real experiences of real people to life. And the kind of questioning goes on to the next generation, Karen, doesn't it? Because one of the things I was struck by towards the end of your book is this doesn't become just about your discovery, but as you say, you tell your sons and you take them with you, and it becomes their discovery too. And there are various questions in Poland and Germany about how they will relate to this past, including a question about passports. Will you just share that with us, maybe?
So we have 2 sons, and 10 years ago, they were very interested in becoming German citizens. They said, I mean, wow, and 10 years ago, they were 24 and 20. And they said, then we could live in the EU, we could work there, we should do this. Now, 10 years ago, they couldn't do it unless I did it. Today, I have now learned, because my nephew just did it, you can get the German citizenship without the 2nd generation. It can skip, actually. But then they couldn't. And I really grappled with that for a good year and a half. Despite I can put on a good face about the collective guilt and all of that, but that was very hard for me. And I came around to say, this is something good that can come out of all this. And I actually think my father would have been definitely do it. So in the end, I am a German citizen, and my 2 sons are, and I gather whatever grandchildren I may have one day, they too will be German citizens.
So something I'm sure people in the audience might want to ask you about a little while on, but it comes really out of your father's love for Germany. which is really interesting. You know, this is something that seems so common when you read the testimonies of Jews pre-Holocaust, is how they saw themselves as German citizens, no less than Alfred Wiener did, someone I'm sure many of you know from the Wiener Library. He was the person who, perhaps more than anyone else, had the foresight into the future to understand what was coming and to begin to sound the alarm. Yet all this went hand in hand with him being a staunchly proud German citizen whose identity was bound up in being a German Jew. His grandson is sitting right next to me. Lord Daniel Finklestein is a journalist, like his grandfather, interested in a free press, like Karen's father, and Jonathan too is a journalist, so I'm sure there's something for the questions here about kind of this drive to write and what does it mean to use your voice in this way. And I'm sure you've seen his writing in the Times, if not about politics, about football. He's now a columnist. Previously, he was the Times' executive editor and chief leader writer. But he's also been intimately involved in politics himself during his career, providing advice to Prime Ministers John Major, David Cameron, and Theresa May. And he was William Hague's Director of Policy. And this book carries over that political drive, enmeshed with the personal. You know, Jonathan's book is about a great historical moment, and Karen's is about those intimate family decisions. I would say that probably Daniel's marries both of those. It's the memoir of his mum and dad, as well as his grandparents, particularly his grandfathers, not just Wiener, although the book starts with that. But his mother's and his father's side had very different experiences, as are hinted at with that title, Hitler and Stalin. So the Wiener side, Daniel is the son of Miriam Finklestein, who is a survivor of Bergen-Belsen, which is where that family was. But his father, Ludwig, survived the Soviet exile to Siberia. And while the whole book is about miraculous survival, there is also this interesting kind of question about commonality and difference. You know, for his parents, it seemed there was a real relationship between the experiences in Bergen-Belsen and the experiences of hard labor in the Gulag. But how that then was treated afterwards, you know, post the Nuremberg trials, as the world became to come to terms with and prosecute Nazi atrocities, but what happened to Russian atrocity. So that's also at the core of this book. And one last thing I'll just pull out before handing over to Daniel, because I think it's very interesting, is that one of the locations that the book is set in is, well, I can give it 3 different names: Lemberg, Lvov, or Lviv. Many of you, I'm sure, have read Philippe Sands' East-West Streets. And I think this book ties in with that, and I know you spoke with Philippe. And kind of interesting when you read about the history behind the Nuremberg trials and what happened politically there, set against the personal experiences of those people from Lviv who then went on to the gulags. There's a real fascinating ethical conundrum at the heart of your book, as well as wonderful family experience and testimony. So let me pass over to Lord Daniel Finklestein.
Thank you so much. Thank you for introducing me. And it's been a privilege to be on the panel with both of you and to listen to your stories. And interesting that you, like me, end up choking on parts of the story, because it's very difficult sometimes to read it, even though you wrote it down yourself. And it's amazing how often that happens. given how often I talk about it. So thank you very much indeed for inviting me. I thought I would start with the extract, and in order to do that, you probably need to know two things. The first is that in preparation for arrest, my grandmother, Greta Wiener, had packed rucksacks with the sort of goods that you were told to take with you if you were ever to be arrested and taken to Westerbork. That's the first thing you need to know. The second is that this involves this story involves my grandmother Greta, my mother Miriam, her two sisters Eva and Ruth, and their home help Betty Levine. On June the 10th, 1943, my mother celebrated her 10th birthday, and Greta gave her a large book, a rich treasury of facts for young people, full of black and white pictures, Dutch history in a nutshell. Miriam didn't get time to read much of it. It was too big for the rucksacks, and on Sunday, the 20th of June, 1943, the time for the rucksacks finally arrived. The first warning came early in the morning, as early as 3:30 a.m. There were sounds in the street, muffled ones, but enough to wake up Greta, enough to wake up Ruth. The soft but unmistakable sound of footsteps, bootsteps actually, on the pavement, a car stopping, muted voices, then silence. Greta and Ruth went to the window and, seeing nothing untoward, tried to calm each other down. Half hour went by and the noises began again, a little louder now, and returning to the window, it was no longer possible to mistake what was going on. There were soldiers everywhere. A pause, and then in the distance, a broadcast of some kind, coming nearer, getting louder. Achtung, Achtung, all Jews need to get ready with their hand luggage. The Aryan population is not allowed to leave their homes. Police orders are to be obeyed. This message over and over again. Inside the apartment, Ruth woke her sisters and Betty, while Greta completed the packing, adding the food they would take, filling the water bottles. Eva asked to bring a sketchbook along with colouring pencils. Ruth took a 1943 pocket diary she'd won in a magazine competition but hadn't used. Everyone got dressed in 3 layers of clothing that had been left out for them. Eva recalled being panic-stricken and terribly afraid, but Ruth thought they were more dazed. And while relief wasn't quite the right word, there was a feeling that at least the waiting and trepidation had come to an end, that this was it. My mother remembered eating a rather odd breakfast with all the sorts of unusual things because we thought we may as well. The things one keeps for special occasions, one might as well eat them. Betty later explained that for at least one of the delicacies, there was a different explanation. It was her 9th anniversary of working for the Wiener family, and she'd asked an Aryan woman to buy the household some strawberries as a treat so they could all celebrate. But Jews weren't allowed such things. They were prohibited from shopping in the market that sold strawberries. Betty realized that along with all their other troubles, there might be further punishment if they were caught with the forbidden fruit. That is why, as the soldiers outside divided up their lists and split into pairs, and 2 of them made their jackbooted way up the stairs to the apartment, the Wieners were sitting at the breakfast table in 3 layers of clothes, eating strawberries. At the door, the soldier read the list: Margareta Wiener, Ruth Wiener, Eva Wiener, Miriam Wiener, Betty Levine, and demanded to see everyone's papers. One of them asked Betty if she was an Aryan, but then saw the J stamped on her ID card. Greta tried showing Alfred's war medals, but the soldiers were unimpressed. They counted the family members. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The family must close the windows, bring the front door key with them, and be downstairs in 10 minutes. At that tense moment, an air raid siren sounded. Betty asked if perhaps they ought to wait until the air raid was over. To this, one of the soldiers responded by shouting, "Enough with your Jewish excuses, stop them or I'll make you get a move on." Then the officers left in order to go and collect the other Jewish tenants in the building. 10 minutes later, there they were, the family, 1, 2, 3, 4, outside the apartment with their rucksacks ready to be taken. Ruth found it odd just to shut the front door and leave behind everything they still possessed, not even being able to give it away. After all the hurrying, they were now left waiting on the pavement for what seemed an age. A small crowd of neighbours gathered, and my mother spotted a young friend among them. And as the soldiers finally began to herd the arrested families together and move them along, she had the presence of mind to tell her friend where the scooter was and to take it. Fortunately, she also had the presence of mind not to ask, "Where's Betty?" So you'll have to find out where Betty is in the next chapter, which I'm not going to read to you so that you all buy my book. Thank you. The reason why I chose that particular segment of the book, and I just wrote down here what they were, is because that comes from 5 different pieces of testimony. And they're rolled together to provide that one account. So Ruth Clements, my aunt, gave testimony to the USC Shoah Foundation and to the Fortunoff Archive. She also wrote a handwritten account of what happened on the 20th of June 1943, which is in the Wiener Library collection under her name, the Wiener Holocaust Library. My Aunt Eva, who died in 1977, before people really had begun to collect them in the same way, had, it turned out, left testimony with an 11-year-old child who was doing a school project, who wrote down really quite a remarkable account of what Eva had to say, and from which I learned 1 or 2 things I otherwise wouldn't have known, and that was in a San Francisco collection, actually. My grandfather, Alfred Wiener, had collected, along with Eva Reichmann, who was one of the first people to make such collections, Holocaust testimony. And he collected from Betty her extraordinary, by the way, story, and what happened to her was completely amazing. And the thing about that is a lot of it contained information my mother didn't know. So I had always known this woman as Betty from Nottingham. That's where she lived. And I then sort of gradually realized she was actually Betty from Berlin and Amsterdam. I found out as a result of reading her testimony that she was someone else entirely. And that was an extraordinary story that my mother clearly was not aware of. Although she told me some things about Betty's life, she wasn't able to tell me the whole story. And then my mother left her testimony with Bayer. She did two or three pieces of testimony, but by far the best is the one that the Association of Jewish Refugees did. And I wouldn't have been able to do that book without that testimony or without the testimony she did of my father. I went to the Wiener Library with my children to show them the library, and there was a 2-minute audio clip of my father. I asked the library to send it to me, and I put it in a drawer, so I just heard it. And about 9 months later, I thought it'd be nice to hear Dad's voice again. I took it out, I put it in the CD player, and to my irritation, it didn't work. So I thought, that's annoying. I took it out, I looked at it, I thought, oh, it's actually a DVD. A bit odd to send me the audio clip on a DVD. I put it in a DVD player, and it was 4 hours of Bea interviewing my father, which I'd been completely unaware of. Had you not done that, Bea, I wouldn't have been able to write my father's part of this story. The way I put this is my mother's story is a highly unusual version of a familiar story to all of us. And my father's a completely bog-standard version of a story that very few people know, even though it affected hundreds of thousands of people. The attempt by Stalin to wipe out all of the Polish elite, to do that by sending them all to Siberia or Kazakhstan, and then shooting the officers in Katyn, all of which is written about here, and these stories, in my view, are complementary because the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is what made both of them possible. And you talk about Nuremberg at the end. My grandfather was involved very much in the Nuremberg trials. My mother was often asked to give speeches in schools. My father was never asked to give speeches in schools, and yet every crime that was committed by the Nazis that they were found guilty of in the Nuremberg trials, the Soviets were undoubtedly guilty of them too. They even got to prosecute the Nuremberg defendants for the Katyn massacres, which they'd committed themselves, although that admittedly did collapse without proceeding to a conclusion. So, but I just wanted to finish, I suppose, with just asking you a couple of questions about testimony, because in addition to the incredible power of it, I think we need to reflect on it too. My grandfather had the view, the truth will win. I think I start the book with a little thing. He said, I am willing, it's in the epigraph of my book, I'm prepared to forget as long as everyone else remembers. A brilliant way of putting it, and he believed the truth would set free the Jews, and he began in 1919 to try to point this out to people before anyone else. And truthfully, it didn't work. But ultimately, it was very successful. It was part of the Nuremberg trials, part of the Eichmann trials. You know, when when Mengele when they was chasing Mengele in Argentina, the Wiener Holocaust Library was the only place that had a picture of him. Otherwise, they wouldn't have known who he was or how to find him. So that kind of work did ultimately succeed, but only once it had failed first. Even testimony, people find difficult to grasp with. And actually, I think that's a lot of what your book's about, and is an extraordinary book for that reason. Secondly, as my story produces, some testimony is wrong. And there are little tiny bits of testimony. So, for example, my mother's recollection of the strawberries, why they had that breakfast was wrong. Betty was the adult, she puts it right. Interestingly, my mother's sometimes right about what sort of trains they were on, and her sister wasn't right. So the sort of work you were doing, going around and actually finding the testimony is finding whether the testimony is true is pretty crucial. Although a very satisfying thing is that anything that happened to one person in the Holocaust usually happened to thousands and thousands of people. So even if you can't find some little part of your parents' story, you can usually find someone else. And I ultimately found what train they were on through someone else's book. Funny if you mentioned Buckingham Palace, but it was a book called Bells into Buckingham Palace, which Karen told me about. And it was critical because he had been on one train and seen the other and knew what form they were. And finally, the biggest problem with it is it's very survivor-centric. So my mother has, in this book, my mother believed that her aunt, Nutti, her aunt Trudy is her real name, and her cousin Fritz and her uncle Jan had died in Auschwitz. Very late in her life, she realized they died in Sobibor. One of the reasons why she just sort of blithely assumed it was Auschwitz is people have heard of Auschwitz because the average time that you lived in Sobibor was 3 hours. And there were only 18 people who ultimately survived from Sobibor, and that was because they weren't actually meant to stay there. Then later they ended up getting to know a bit more about it because there was a breakout in Sobibor, otherwise we wouldn't know anything about it. Those people died without being able to leave testimony. I've tried my very best to reconstruct their lives, but actually it is thinner than the others. You know, I did find out some things, but my book is therefore based on those people who did survive and their close relatives, and the people who didn't survive, their stories are much harder to tell. And that is something that we have to compensate for in thinking about the history of the Holocaust. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daniel. I've just been instructed, because we are running behind, we're not going to take questions now, but you are free to come in the coffee break and grab one of our three speakers and try and speak to them personally. So I'm going to kind of take Chair's privilege to just ask the final question to tie this session up for the last couple of minutes. And that's in response to something you just said about being a survivor, and that it's harder to tell the stories of people who didn't survive than did survive. But you also look in the book at how hard it is to tell the stories of people who did survive, because it's how you tell the story. And there's a really interesting thing you point out where your mum is covered in a book, a photography book of survivors. And she says, I'm a survivor last. You know, before that, she is a mother, a daughter, you know, a teacher. You know, she is all these other personal things. You know, being a survivor is just one part of her identity. Yeah. So I just want to ask you first, and then we'll quickly have Karen and Jonathan finish up. You know, to what extent do you think testimony, and the testimony you've used, which focuses on the experience of survival, is able to also portray all those other things that the people you're writing about was? And is there anything you'd like to share about who they are as a last nugget?
Well, my mother was, for those people who knew her will know this, but she was sort of amazingly kind of level-headed about things. And I just remember coming down, when Ronald Reagan went to he was going to go to Bitburg, where the SS graves were, and there was a big fuss about it, so he decides he's going to go to Belsen as well. And I heard this upstairs. I went downstairs to the kitchen, told my mum, she's washing up, her back's to me, and I said, oh, Mum, Ronald Reagan's going to go to Belsen, and she replied, so what, I've been. That was my mum. But she did want to tell her story. and she thought that was incredibly important. We're incredibly grateful to the organisations that made that possible for her right up to the end. I found it, therefore, it's my duty to take that on. It's one of the reasons I've written this book. Although I will admit, the other reason is that what sort of a journalist would I be if you had two stories like my mum and my dad? They are just incredible, right down to the home help, through the library. The whole thing's amazing. If I didn't write that down, I'd be the worst journalist that ever lived.
I know. Especially since the others had to go hunting for testimony, you had a whole archive there ready and waiting. Thank you. Karen, is there a last nugget you'd like to share?
I think I'd say oops, hold on. I'd like to think I gave a full picture of who my dad really was in the world, and I will share with you that I struggled with whether to publish this. And I actually called the rabbi at the synagogue I grew up in Dallas, who knew my parents for 40 years, knew my dad, and I said, I'm really worried about reframing my father in this community.